Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. I'll do a quick introduction to the author, go into a spoiler-free overview of the plot, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Dennis Lehane is a pretty well-known crime author. He has written several books. One of them I reviewed for the channel a few years ago called Since We Fell. And I'll leave that link below if you want to check that out. He wrote Mystic River, Gone Baby Gone, and Shutter Island, which have all been made into movies. He has a production deal with Apple TV Plus, and I believe he is working on a production of this, adapting this into a movie as well. This is the story of a character named Mary Pat, who in the summer of 1974 is living in South Boston, has grown up in South Boston and Southie, and it's around the time where there is a court order to integrate the schools, so they will begin busing white students to predominantly black neighborhoods and black students to predominantly white neighborhoods in order to integrate the schools. And that's kind of the backdrop of the novel. The main thrust of the novel and the main question of the novel is what has happened to Mary Pat's daughter, who has gone out with her boyfriend and a couple of other friends and has since disappeared. And so the first, I'd say, 2/3 of the novel is finding out what happened to Mary Pat's daughter, Jules, and Mary Pat tracking down and solving that mystery. The book also has a main character of a police officer who is investigating the homicide of a young black man who was murdered in the neighborhood. And there is a question of who has murdered him, why they've murdered him. And so those things are kind of going on at both the same time in the book. The book mainly is the story of Mary Pat and her looking to find her daughter. That's the main gist of the story, after her daughter, who is 17, has disappeared. So I did like the character Mary Pat quite a bit. I think it's an interesting character. On one hand, she's clearly a character who's has gone through a lot. In her early 40s, she has 2 children, Jules, who has since disappeared, and her earlier child, or her oldest child, Noel, who had served in Vietnam and came back and got hooked on heroin and died of an overdose. And she has been married twice, both one time I think ending in her first husband, who was a criminal, who was basically a cat burglar, and her second husband, who has left her, has gone to Cambridge and has kind of left the neighborhood. So I thought that was an interesting character, the idea of this character who's kind of has for a long time relied on the rules of this world, and the rules of the world are no longer kind of serving her basic needs, and she starts to question them. And so it's really a story about, as much as anything, about becoming disillusioned with the world around you. And that's one of the main things about the character and about this book that I enjoyed quite a bit. It's a relatively lean book. It's only 300 pages. The first half of it really does have a pretty good clip to it, where you're going, it's pretty much a page turner, and you're going at a pretty good clip to get through, I'd say, about the first half. The side characters, Dennis Lehane's really good at introducing side characters that are interesting, and you realize that he's kind of building out this world in a very organic way of just kind of following Mary Pat as she goes about her day. She works at a hospital, and meeting kind of the women who she works with at the hospital, meeting her sister, meeting her ex-husband, and you just really make the world feel organic and real, in a real nice way, a nice sense of building out this world and making it feel like a real place. If there's some things I didn't like about it as much, the dialogue in some points I thought was pretty clunky. There are times where I thought that these characters wouldn't necessarily say these things. There's some plot points as well that I had a hard time kind of believing. Like I said, the first, I'd say 2/3 of it moves pretty quickly. The last third of it was not so much. I felt myself kind of to struggle to kind of finish the book. I felt that the book reminded me of some other things that I'll talk about that in a minute. But the book that I had in my mind when I was reading, I'm like, okay, where is this going to go? And I started thinking about where it was going to go. It ended up not going where I was going to go with it, which is fine. I mean, it's not a crime to do that. But I felt that would have been in one hand, I appreciate not knowing where the story was going. On the other hand, it was like, well, this story that you're telling me, though, is a story I've kind of already seen a couple times before, and I felt less interested with that story than maybe the one I was more interested in that you didn't tell me. And then I think too, and I've seen a little bit on Goodreads, and I think this is going to be a criticism you see when this book is reviewed. I think there are some characters who feel pretty stock or pretty stereotypical. The cop that's investigating the disappearance of Jules and the homicide of the black teenager are both He is a Vietnam vet who comes back and is hooked on heroin for a little bit before becoming a cop. And that character felt very much like the cop who is struggling to do good, but is ultimately a good cop with a heart of gold. That character feels pretty stock to me, and I thought that there was a couple of subplots in the novel that didn't really end up adding to very much. One of them involves the cop. You're just kind of like, do we need this in this book? And the answer is probably not. I understand from a mechanical standpoint of why that character is in the book. But on the other hand, I kind of felt that there could have been maybe a better way to introduce that without landing where the subplot landed. And then what I thought was the most interesting part about the book to me was, I think it's actually the book itself is to me okay. It wasn't mind-blowing, but I thought that the book does probably lend itself well to a book club where you can ask kind of larger questions about this world, because the book does really ultimately kind of come down to hate. How do people transfer hate? How learned is hate? Who is responsible ultimately for the actions of someone who hates another person? Or if someone does something that you indirectly help them do, what is your responsibility? Is that responsibility different for adults than it is for children? And how does that work? And so I think the book does ask some pretty heavy questions that I think are pretty interesting. I also think that whenever you're dealing with a real time period where there are still living people who live through this time period, I think there are people who are going to be upset, and I did see this on Goodreads a little bit, of being inaccurately portrayed. And I think Dennis Lehane tries, maybe you could make an argument that he tries a little glancingly or half-heartedly to try to give some different reasons for the different opinions that people had. And I think you could probably make an argument that he could have probably tried a little harder to show different viewpoints of view, and because he doesn't, I think it does come off a little bit like you're saying that this whole area is racist, one, or criminal, two, or just people who live there are no good. And I think that there are people who will take that away from this book and be kind of angered by it. And it's a book about, in some ways it's a book about crime, and so some of that can be kind of, I think, forgiven. But when you kind of open it up to a larger world, there are presumably some non-criminals who live in Southie. So Dennis Lehane doesn't, I think, do a particularly great job of bringing some of those opinions out. The book that it reminded me of, there's two things that it reminded me of: Three Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri, the movie, and City on Fire, for sure. And those things kind of, to me, approximate where this is. This book goes much deeper into dealing with racism and dealing with prejudice and where racism comes from, and how hate is spread and all those things. But if you liked either one of those things, I think you'll like this. And like I said, to me, part of the book, the best part of the book is kind of those jumping off points for further discussions. Is it okay for you to use or change or twist or add fictional accounts? Because one of the things at the center of this book, which is the death of the young black man, which that did not happen in real life. And so he's basically adding a fictional event to this story, and the question is that wrong? Should you not do that? Is this close enough to other things that did happen to make it okay? And so I think that the conversation around this book, I think, is going to be interesting. I think there may be people who are going to bounce off the book, because the book is pretty bleak. And, I haven't read Mystic River. I've only seen the movie. I think it's hard to read this book having seen Mystic River, and part of it is because Mystic River was so good, the movie at least, and not compare it to Mystic River, because there's a lot of overlap there. And so if you like Dennis Lehane and you're not from Southie, you may like this book. I think a lot of people will like it. I'm sure it's going to do something on HBO or Apple TV Plus. Sorry, Apple TV Plus is where his deal is. It's going to be made into a television short series or a movie, and I'm sure there are people who are going to like it a lot. I was left pretty mad. I think that some of the bigger questions I think are interesting. I wish there had been more surprises, maybe, or maybe it's just enough of a different twist to make it feel new or different. It felt very familiar in some ways to me when I was reading it. And like I said, there's some characters who I think are kind of left in the cold, who are introduced, who are interesting, and then we don't really go back to some of those things. And then finally, I do think there's going to be some truth to the idea that, like, City on Fire, to compare it to City on Fire, I think that talks about this kind of cataclysmic event in the history of New York City, which was the blackout, and it shows you from these different viewpoints. And so you get a sense of, well, here are the different viewpoints that we had about this thing. I don't think the book really does that as far as the busing protest. And so I think that's to its discredit. I don't know how Dennis Lehane could have done that. He could have done it in several different ways as far as, unless, I don't know how he could have done that in a not broken kind of the way, the format he had set up. But I still think he could have done it if he had really wanted to. And I think that there's going to probably be some criticism for him not doing that, but it's his book. But, so that's what it is. If you're a fan of Dennis Lehane, the book does have a lot of difficult material. Like I said, there's a lot of racism. There's a lot of slurs that are used. There is a child in peril. There is a murder. There is violence in the book. There is substance abuse in the book. There is inappropriate relationships with minors in the book. So there's just like a long list of stuff that, like, if any of those things bother you, you may have a hard time with the book. But I think from a craft standpoint, I think he does a great job, and he has his own unique voice, and you either like that or you don't. I did see some people on Goodreads complain that he uses too many metaphors and similes, and I think that's his style. I personally liked him quite a bit. I thought he was really good at those. The dialogue to me was a little clunky, and there are times where I thought that it could have been cleaned up, could have been shortened, could have been truncated, and I think it would have been more effective. There's sometimes other too where I was like, there's no way this character would have said that thing, and there's some scenes that kind of felt a little cheesy. But overall, Small Mercies, I think, as far as a book club book, I think it would be an interesting book club if you have a book club that's very much about relatively dark, bleak books. I think this is definitely not a book to read on like a Sunday at the beach if that's the mood you're kind of going for. But otherwise, I think it was well done, and except for the exceptions that I mentioned. And Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. I'm sure if you don't get a chance to read the book, I'm sure it's going to become a television series or a movie near you quite soon. And I think when I saw that Apple TV Plus was involved, or he had a deal with Apple TV Plus, it did remind me that City on Fire was also made by Apple TV Plus, and I felt like those two books, I don't think they're necessarily in conversation, but there's a lot of similarities there. And I also think, like I said, 3 Billboards. So if you kind of combine those two things, you do kind of get an approximation of what this book is, in my opinion. And next time I'm going to be reading City of Blows by Tim Blake Nelson. Really looking forward to this to see what it is. Checking it out, it does seem interesting. So until next time, like I said, I'll leave the video link below if you want to check out my review of Since We Fell. If you did get a chance to read Small Mercies and you feel strongly about it one way or the other, please let me know below. If there's parts of it that you really didn't care for, there are parts that you loved that you'd like me to know, please let me know below. Please don't spoil it for anybody, but until next time, I'll leave my link to my Twitter account if you want to follow me there. Please like and subscribe. Until next time, bye.